Department. He is invoking Section 740 of the Home Rule Act in D.C. to do this. And joining us now to discuss is Robin Bureau, Democratic strategist and former Obama Regional Campaign Director. Also joining us is Hadley Manning, Executive Vice President and Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. So first of all, good afternoon to you both. Thank you very much for joining us. Hadley, I'll start with you today. Can I get your first reactions to everything that's transpired this morning with President Trump calling this Liberation Day in D.C.?
Of course. The relationship between Washington, D.C. and the federal government is unique. It's not like the relationship between other states or cities and the federal government. And I emphasize the term federal government because it's not just the president who matters here, but also Congress. Congress delegated a lot of local authority to the city and city council, the mayor of Washington, D.C., back when Richard Nixon was in office. And this was the beginning of what we call home rule for Washington, D.C. Now, the president does have authority over the National Guard. And what he's doing here is not accurately really described as a federal takeover of Washington, D.C., but it is a takeover of the D.C. police force, and it is a measure meant to underscore crime rates, homelessness, some of the local challenges of living in Washington, D.C. And ultimately, I think this is a political message, not just to Washington, D.C., but to many Democrats who control most of the most populous cities in the United States and almost all of the cities that have some of the highest crime rates in the country. So this is a safety and security message that President Trump is trying to make good on. He's talked about taking over Washington, D.C. in many of his campaign promises and speeches, and now he's emphasizing that he's not going to tolerate the crime rates in Washington, D.C., and I think it's meant to send a message across the country as well.
Okay, Robin, what do you think? What stood out to you today?
What stood out to me is that the police department in D.C. has been working really hard to curtail crime. You can look at FBI crime stats. I pulled them right here. I've got them right here. Violent crime is down by 26% over the last 10 years. Homicide is down by 12%. And assault with a deadly weapon is down by 20%. I think this is a slight to the hard work that our men and women in blue are doing and have been doing in D.C. to lower the crime rate. However, Hadley is exactly correct. President Trump has a unique position there because there is no governor of D.C. President Trump directly controls the National Guard for D.C., so he's within his right to do this. I think it sends the wrong message. My friends on the left are calling this a distraction from the Epstein files. Of course they would say that.
Okay, Hadley, can I get your reaction to what Robin is saying in terms of data, that violent crime is down 26%, total crime is down 7%, and this is also according to police department data, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. Is there a need for federal involvement?
Well, certainly you can look at data from the last few years and see that this trend in Washington, D.C. and some other major some other major cities is encouraging. And a lot of that is a fall off from extremely high rates that we saw during the COVID pandemic and immediately following the COVID pandemic. So I would take a lot of the data from the most recent years, especially the trend line, with a grain of salt. I would look back further. I'd look back at the trend in homicides, for example, in Washington, D.C., and we see that in 2024, that homicide rate, after coming down for several years, after 2020, 2021, when it got very high, still higher than what we saw in 2019, 2018, and years preceding the COVID pandemic. So yes, the trends may be encouraging specifically when we look at the most recent years, but Washington, D.C. still has a very high homicide rate when compared to other parts of the country, higher than most other major cities. The carjackings in Washington, D.C. are 3 times the national average. So it stands out. Unfortunately, I mean, this is a city that so many of us love, and of course we all love and admire and appreciate the hard work of Washington, D.C.'s police force, but it is a problem. It is a city that all of us, Democrats, Republicans, Americans, should be proud of and should feel like we can safely visit without fear of crime or having our property stolen. And that's, I think, what President Trump is trying to address here. Again, I think the message is not just for Washington, D.C. residents, it's for people across the country. If you look at our top 30 cities when it comes to crime rate, 27 of those are Democrat controlled. So these local government issues, safety issues, are very difficult, I think, for Republicans and Democrats alike. But this will be an interesting experiment to see if President Trump's tough on crime approach and the National Guard's involvement here will be effective at combating what's been a very difficult problem for the city for a long time.
So, Robin, what do you say to that point where the crime rate, even though it's down a little bit compared to previous years, that it's still very high? And President Trump also highlighted this point in that press briefing, saying that the murder rate is higher than compared to Mexico City.
Yeah, and I can look. I'm glad you asked. I've got statistics right here. The crime rate in DC is 3.8 people per 1,000. I can just say that in Republican states, Louisiana, Johnson's state is 6.2, South Dakota, Thune state, 2.7, South Carolina, Lindsey Graham state, 4.7, Florida, Marco Rubio, 3.8. These are all higher than the crime rates that we're experiencing right now in DC. So I reject the premise that this is just blue states. I think that this is a problem nationwide. We have to do something about crime. This is not a red state or blue state or red city or blue city issue. Crime affects us all. And we do have to do something. Now, I reject wholeheartedly the option of rounding up our nation's homeless, and especially in DC, and because it's just inhumane to me. This is also illegal. This has been tried in states that I've lived in, at cities that I've lived in. This was tried in Columbia, South Carolina, for example. It failed. It was deemed to be unconstitutional. They were detained without cause. It happened right here in Tucker, Georgia. Same thing. They were rounded up. They were detained without cause. This is not how this is done, and this is not how we treat human beings in this country.
Okay, Hadley, I was going to talk about the homeless situation a little bit later in the interview, but since Robin brought it up, what do you think? I mean, is moving the homeless, as Trump put it, far away from the Capitol, is that just shifting the problem?
Well, of course, it's shifting the problem, right? It's just literally physically moving the problem. I think, for visitors to the nation's capital, many of whom are tourists, this is not just about safety and security. Obviously, it's also about what President Trump is calling beautification. It's about removing some of the people who are experiencing homelessness, literally removing them and moving them to different areas. And other cities, other states, Democrat controlled, Republican controlled, as Robin mentioned, have tried similar measures. Ultimately, homelessness is a very difficult problem to address. It is one that is mixed with several other problems, including mental health, including drugs, and including substance abuse. So there's a lot to unpack here. However, I don't believe that any resident or visitor to Washington, D.C. wants to be walking around encampments, be walking around areas where, it is not necessarily the right of anyone to pitch a tent in the middle of a public park or public sidewalk. These are rights and these are areas where we have to find balance, and we have to talk about it's also the public's right and the public's ability to enjoy our national monuments, our national capitals, our sidewalks and areas that are meant to be for the public's use and enjoyment. There's a proper use of those spaces and there's an improper use. It's not meant to be someone's home. It's not supposed to be somewhere where someone lives. Now, addressing the root causes of why people are putting up tents and why people are trying to make sidewalks into their homes is a much deeper, much harder issue. But in terms of making certain areas off limits and enforcing camping bans, for example, I think President Trump and others are within their prerogative to say this area is for the enjoyment of the entire public. It is not supposed to be someone's home. It's supposed to be a sidewalk. It's supposed to be our nation's Capitol building. It's supposed to be a monument. It's supposed to be something that we look at and we say, we all own this. This belongs to all of us and we can all enjoy it. It's not meant to be a place where you park and stay.
Okay, Robin, I want to get your response, but I also want to ask you, how do you think Trump's latest move is going to affect relations between D.C. Officials as well as local leadership?
There's a problem here because it's going to seem like he's overstepping the boundaries. And one thing that I love about Republicans is that they talk about states' rights, and I respect that. It's one thing I respect and admire about Republicans. But I will see this as sort of trouncing some of those right now. And I think my party will probably be fairly criticizing that. However, Hadley's exactly correct. The homelessness issue is, there are root causes. There's addiction, there's mental health concerns. All of those need to be addressed. And we need to look and see what's worked in other places and pick what works and to disregard what doesn't work. It's a complicated and nuanced issue. There's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution for the entire country. This needs to be handled by municipalities.
Okay, Hadley, since we're talking about root causes, do you think Trump's plans, including deploying the National Guard in D.C. as well as DEA and the FBI, does that strike at the root cause of why crime is happening in the city?
Well, I think crime is a separate issue from homelessness, right? So yes, they often run together, and we do see, unfortunately, people experiencing homelessness can commit crimes, but they can also be victims of crime. However, if we step aside from the homelessness issue and focus purely on crime, violent crime, property crime, yes, I do think that when President Trump uses his political messaging, his bully pulpit as President of the United States, as the commander of our military and the director of our National Guard, when he steps in to this degree, it will send a message that Washington, D.C. is no longer going to tolerate crime. It's no longer going to tolerate violence, and no longer going to it's not going to tolerate the destruction of property. That will send a message to people within the Washington, D.C. area. I do believe that tough on crime policies, having more officers, whether they are D.C. police officers or members of our military, members of our National Guard, that having the presence of more officers on more corners in Washington, D.C. will be helpful. You can look at other experiments with different policing strategies, but certainly having more people in uniform will be helpful. And I think the Washington, D.C. police force, maybe they feel miffed that the National Guard is stepping in here, but maybe they also feel like they're welcome to have this kind of backup, to have more officers and more people helping them in their ultimate mission, which is to keep the public safe.
Robin, same question to you. What do you think? Is it going to deter crime?
I'm not really sure. That will remain to be seen. But there's one thing that we're not talking about is there's a beautification component of this. That's something that I actually do agree with the president on. He's using this as a means to upgrade and renovate some of the existing infrastructure and buildings. And that I'm all for. So, let's, like I said, take the good, leave the bad.
Okay, Hadley, do you think a hypothetical federal takeover of D.C., would it make the city safer in the long run?
Well, it would certainly change a lot about the city of Washington, D.C., and I think most residents and voters in Washington, D.C. wouldn't appreciate a federal takeover. However, it is, again, to get back to what I said at the beginning, it's not purely the choice of President Trump. He would have to have legislation go through both houses of Congress, including meeting a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, to undo some of the devolution of powers that took place when Nixon was in office during the initiation of the Home Rule project. So yes, it could be done. It's not outside of the constitutional, it's not outside of what is possible, certainly legally, but it's not something that will happen in one day with the snap of President Trump's fingers. It's not something as simple as moving in the National Guard, but it would be something that would ultimately affect the city, not just in terms of public safety, but in terms of all of the decisions that are made by people who live in Washington, D.C. And those decisions, rather than being made at the local level with a city council and a mayor, would be moved back to congressional oversight, would be something that Congress would get to decide.
Okay, Robin, we can pretty much wrap up this conversation now. Any final thoughts?
I just want to make sure that we do not criminalize our nation's homeless. Every time that's been tried, it has been a very bad thing, especially for Republicans headed to the midterms.
Well, all right then. Thank you both for coming on. Hadley, Robin, pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up.